Good afternoon. It's a privilege and honor to be here and speak at the Global Lecture Series. I want to thank Dr. Vicki Shields, Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences and Social Work, for giving me this opportunity to share the work that I do with all of you present here. My talk today, The Politics of Water, Power, Knowledge, and Agency in Global Water Governance, is an effort to understand a system institutionalized in place by processes of globalization and intensification of transnational activism. The intent here is not to argue whether privatization is good or bad, but to understand the process of global water governance through which certain forms of knowledge, values, and practices get established in policy, and the way water is positioned amongst these actors comes to determine the frame as to how water is imagined, contested, implemented, tackled, or reformed. So the focus here is more on the process of the policies of global water governance rather than the impact study on global water governance. Now, water is a really global issue today in a sense that water crisis is one of the most contemporary challenges that humanity faces today. It's now being widely accepted that water is not about a crisis of scarcity, but water is about a crisis of governance. Although the concept of global governance is itself debated, but there is also a general understanding that global domain requires some form of governance, standardization, and application of rules, whether formal or informal, strict or loose, transitory or permanent, public or private. If global governance is about the transnational arena, if it is about formulation of policies and standardization of set rules, mobilization of resources, allocation of resources, then water is indeed a subject of governance, although it is not essentially global, but it is increasingly becoming global. So, I define water governance not in a form of a top-down institutionalized approach which began in the early 70s, where we had a form of global governance that included regime formation, where states came together, went in for a treaty, and went back and implemented what they had agreed upon. What I'm focusing here as a form of global governance is a decentralized web of actors, networks, processes, and movements. These actors are both bound by a variety of discourses, and they also use a variety of discourses, and they interact with each other. So global water governance is therefore about multiple actors at multiple sites with different agendas at multiple scales, interacting with each other, and the outcome of that action and interaction is determined by the power relationship amongst them, which may create forces of subjectivity or forms of resistance. So this is just a kind of a diagram to show the multiple scales on which global water governance actually works, and also multiple players which are involved in the practices of global water governance. Just a historical overview of global water governance. For the first time, water was discussed on the international agenda in the United Nations Conference in 1997. But due to a lack of material visibility, none of the objectives of creating a regime of global water governance could be met. It was actually in 1992 at the Dublin Principles when, for the first time in the history of water, water was actually recognized as a problem, something that was in crisis, and at the same time, something that needed to be governed. Water was also recognized not only as a social, but also as an economic good. Water was definitely in need of management because water was a threat to sustainable development. And while the Dublin Principles acknowledged water on the global stage, at that very point of time, international changes were also going on the global economic and political agenda, with discourses of liberalization and processes of globalization evolving. I want to, although this chart really sounds complicated, what I just want to show you is how does global water governance operate. Now, global water governance is couched in the discourse of sustainable development, which means balanced economic growth, balanced environmental resources, having an intergenerational, interequity, and justice objectives. Global water governance operates through transnational knowledge networks. These are the transnational knowledge networks which emerge from global entities like the World Bank, the United Nations Development Program, the Environmental Program, global water partnerships, and these knowledge networks communicate through publications, conferences, reports, and think tanks. These knowledge networks have evolved over a period of time in history, and we kind of see that these knowledge networks actually began with the formation of regional epistemic communities in the 1960s and the 1970s. Scientific and scholarly people worked with the government, keeping in mind the interest of the government. The purpose, of course, here in the region, and which extended later globally, was to actually accumulate knowledge about water, water issues, water reform, and water management. In the period of 1980s and to the 1990s, these networks transformed themselves as global knowledge networks, NET we call them, and these knowledge networks were, again, not only about accumulation of knowledge about water, but it was also about dissemination of knowledge about water. So they had certain institutions and actors in place through which they tried to disseminate that knowledge. And the third, of course, which we see in the 1990s, is called the global public policy networks. And these public policy networks engaged with the bank, global water partnerships, and bilateral donors and non-governmental organizations and think tanks. And the purpose of this global public policy network was to enter the realm of politics, simplify the complex ideas behind global water governance, and naturalize the problems about water to the people. So if you look at it, there are two major functions these knowledge communities were actually trying to perform. The first function was formulation, standardization, and simplification of the knowledge relating to water resource management. And second, once the formulation, standardization, and simplification of water resource management knowledge was reached, the next purpose was how to legitimize that knowledge and how to form alliances on the ground to implement that knowledge on a national scale. For the legitimization and forming of alliances on the ground, global water governance networks operates through two forces. One, of course, is the policy transfer force, and so the legitimization of this knowledge is done through political systems, engagement with the bureaucracies, legal systems, stakeholders, and the demographics. And this policy transfer actually takes place either through a coercive policy, which is a standardized model for conditionalities and structural adjustments of the World Bank and the IMF, or through normative ideas, where ideas become an agent of change in policy transformation. So, and once this policy transfer actually comes through, either through normative or through coercive programs, water policy, water law, water institutions, water organizations are all affected by it, and the purpose then is to fulfill the Millennium Development Goals of the United Nations, which is to have access of water for everyone by 2050. These kind of cases then are also known as the best practices case, which are then promoted by these very knowledge networks in different parts of the world through these examples. This is just a good, two examples of global public policy networks and what they constitute. As you can see, there's a World Water Council, which is a common umbrella to unite disparate, fragmented, and ineffectual efforts on global water management. This council was actually established at the initiative of the World Bank. It's an international water policy think tank, and also of the governments of European countries, especially France. France has an important role to play as far as water is concerned. Most of the multinational companies that work in treatment, distribution of water are actually based in France. And then, of course, we had the Global Water Partnership, which encourages close relationship between the public sector and the private sector. It also has a Business Partners for Development, which is an initiative of non-governmental organizations, bilateral donors, the World Bank, as well as water sector companies. Sometimes we wonder who participates in these global public policy networks. The diagram I'm going to show you is a little complex, but what I want you to really see is, in a simplified image, that when you look at the multiple water institutions that we are seeing, they all are kind of tied to each other, and world water institutions constitute one large interest group. For example, the vice president of the World Water Council is the vice president of Suez, which is the biggest water multinational in the world which engages in water. You can see the advisor to the president of World Water Council is again the director of another multinational water company that really works in water treatment and water distribution. You have these multiple institutions that are tied into the World Bank and the IMF, which has a sector approach to water. And you can also see even the Global Water Partnership has links and was actually made on the initiative of these institutions. So what we actually see here is multiple institutions in water, but these multiplicity of these institutions mask the few influential corporations and the World Bank that effectively try to control global water politics. These policy networks are also kind of considered to be of trisectoral nature and are generally referred to a kind of a quasi-corporatist alliances. As you can see that there are three alliances and three major networks that you see, alliances of government agencies and international financial organizations, private water sector companies, as well as civil societies, communities, and non-governmental groups. What are the knowledge claims of these networks? To just briefly give you a sense that these knowledge claims about water that these networks constitute are that there is a crisis in water, water is scarce around the world, water is also scarce in the urban sector, there's a lack of access to water because there's an inefficient public sector. To do away with the problems of the inefficient public sector, we need to encourage non-state actors, and these non-state actors are water companies. These water companies will provide good water resource management, which will lead to economic growth, poverty alleviation, and sustainable development. So that's the way the knowledge claims of these actors are promoted. With the overview that I just talked about, I want to now try and talk about how these principles that I just discussed operated in practice in the Delhi water privatization case. Privatization is a very contested word in a country like India and a lot of other developing countries. So it's either couched in the name of urban water sector reform or public-private partnership or even outsourcing. So global water governance in practice in India, actually until the 1980s, the government of India that had opted for a mixed economy actually channeled all state planning and all state budget, and urban water provisions, management, distribution of water was left to the sole domain of the individual state and the utility or the board that that state created. But by the 1990s, we saw a shift in the understanding of water as discourses of globalization evolved, and we saw that water moved from the public sector to the infrastructure sector as a service delivery. So this case that I talk about today is not only important from the point of view of India and the region, but it's also important for many parts of the developing societies where processes of globalization and neoliberalization are dominating government planning and the government agenda. So this case study allows us to understand how water gained relevance to kind of to be contested or to be reformed in Delhi. This is a map of Delhi, and this is a map of India, and Delhi is kind of situated in northern India, and the water board that supplies water to Delhi is an autonomous agency that is actually funded by the Delhi government. The Delhi government funds this water board. I do acknowledge that there are issues of inequity in water distribution. There's also a lot of non-revenue water that is lost in the water distribution. There are also problems of demand and supply. Oh, it's okay. The government's vision, what was the government's vision as far as water reform was concerned to ensure that demand matched supply, water was distributed to everyone, and people and the poor had access to water? The government's vision was provision of a universal 24/7 safe water supply, which was to be done by an efficient, customer-oriented, and accountable service provider. So in other words, what the government was actually saying was that there would be a private sector company that would actually come in and provide equitable, efficient, and sustainable service, which would be 24/7, means water will run in the taps 24/7. The government's plan consisted of unbundling. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, all provisions of augmentation of water, distribution of water, treatment of water was done by the Delhi Jal Board. Now the government planned that it would unbundle the Delhi Jal Board, and it would actually give augmentation of water still would remain the responsibility of the agency, the Delhi Water Board, which is a government autonomous agency, and treatment was contracted to Suez NDO, which is a multinational company, which is a subsidiary of Suez, and distribution also was to be contracted to 5 multinational corporations that work in water, Bechtel, United India, a couple more, and these were shortlisted. The question, water, as you can see, then became a field of governance. What this actually shows is, it's a really complex diagram, but what it's trying to show is that there were multiple actors in trying to reform water in Delhi. There were multiple sites from where this knowledge of reform was coming from, and so you can see a multiplicity of force relationships between these actors. So you have the IMF, you have the World Bank, you have the consultants, you have NGOs, communities, and the government of India. How was this implemented in the case of India? Now, India has been a vibrant and a plural democracy, so it was not easy for the IMF and the World Bank to kind of use the coercive mechanism or the standard approach of conditionality and structural adjustment programs in relation to reforms, either in the social sector, especially including water. So the government had negotiated with these global entities about a gradual and controlled liberalization, which was to be sequenced and structured in the first generation of reforms and then the second generations of reform when the balance of payment crisis hit India in 1991. So therefore, the bank had to understand the social, cultural, and psychological environment in which it had to operate. The second way, as we talked about, was the policy entrepreneurs, or the normative functioning in which information needed to be transmitted. And the normative functioning was the ideas, carriers of ideas. These were policy entrepreneurs. Policy entrepreneurs play an important role in policy coordination and policy development. And a lot of time, it is through these networks of policy entrepreneurs that knowledge of external influences is brought to bear upon policymaking elites. So the bank started to function on 3 major scales. The first, of course, was knowledge production or knowledge generation. This is not for you guys to read, but it's just to give you a sense of how much the bank was functioning in terms of producing the information that was necessary to develop a consensus on water reform. And this is just a very small overview of the papers written on subsidies, tariffs, household surveys to show that water reform was needed in India. Most of these papers were distributed to relevant policymakers, service providers, and other stakeholders in India. This was the first step with which the bank emerged in water sector reform in India by saying that information has been gathered, this information supports the idea that water needs to be reformed. So knowledge production and knowledge accumulation was the first thing that the bank did, and it tried to disseminate that knowledge through these papers. The second thing that the bank did was how to legitimize that knowledge, how to get people to understand that this is relevant, this is natural, and this is important, and this will benefit the people of India. Legitimization of that knowledge came through on-the-ground alliances, and in India's case, the bureaucrats and the laterals played a very important role. Who were these laterals? Laterals are people who are educated in the United Kingdoms or the United States and have large international networks. They operate outside of the bureaucratic realm, and they act as advisors to the minister and the prime minister in the government. In between their stints, as they act as advisors to the prime minister of the country, they also maintain their networks with these global policy entities, the World Bank, the IMF, the DC think tanks, where they go for training, they go for workshops, they also occupy small positions in those. These laterals in India did not only have the experience of their own ideas, but also experience of the ideas in the networks that they operated, where the discourses of liberalization had actually evolved. So what was the role of these laterals? These laterals performed a major task. These laterals were the link between the space of global entities and conference rooms where ideas about privatization and liberalization were generated, and between the policymakers where these ideas had to be applied and implemented. And the advantage that these laterals had was that they were always behind the scenes creating policy reports and regulatory strategies. As I can show you, and the third thing that the bank did was marketing and promoting the knowledge that it had generated. This was done, as you can see, through an initiative that involved $7.5 million to build a consensus on water sector reform in India. The policy dialogue was one where they had a lot of workshops and seminars and presentations. There were public awareness dialogues where you had the common people, NGOs, advocacy networks that came together. And the whole idea was to develop a consensus on water reform. And of course, there was Running Water, which was a dialogue for journalists to improve coverage on urban water reform, which meant good governance, sustainable development, and economic growth. So, and that's how the bank operated. And as you can see, these were the claims that the bank made, which ties in with the World Water Institution's claim that private sector participation brings us efficiency, allows poverty alleviation, cost recovery is essential. I do not deny that price is definitely an issue in developing countries like India, and of course, private operators will be accountable through clear performance criteria. Now, as the bank was doing this knowledge generation, dissemination of knowledge, and marketing of this knowledge, the laterals were also working in the Indian government sector. And the laterals produced, again, a number of knowledge generation for its own people. Here. And this, again, not for us to read, but to show the amount of information that was generated to produce this knowledge that water sector needed reform. And similarly, you know, the knowledge claims of the government, as you can see, tie into the outlook of the World Bank as well as the consultants. The consultants were all consultants that were operating from Europe. None of the consultants were from India. The consultants came in, did the statistics, wrote the numbers, and as the stories told by the statistics were accommodated in the knowledge claims of the government. The government does not use the word privatization. It uses the word outsourcing for cost efficiency and quality services. Okay. The claims of the multinational corporation, quickly, just to give you a sense, also showed that the corporation on its website also emphasizes sustainable development at the very heart of these activities. And these companies are there to serve the people. That's the ideology behind it. So, and this is just a simple image to show you that there are networks of power that operated between the, at multiple scales at the bank, the government, the NCD, Delhi. Now, this knowledge generation that was producing a discourse which said that water needed to be managed for sustainable development and private sector participation was necessary was not universally accepted as a problem solution by the people of India. So where were the potential sources of intervention in global water governance? We saw one, of course, was through invited participants, and second was through collective action, which was networks of resistance. I do want to mention both the bank and the government of India and the government of Delhi used terms like public consultation, participatory processes, stakeholder conferences, and workshops. And although all of these engagements did not alter the foundational assumptions of the water reform draft, they definitely were a strategic decision to present this reform as uncontroversial and as based on consensus. So the networks of resistance are some of the pictures really show here. These are different disparate groups with different agendas along the river and in the city of Delhi from where the water was to be augmented and transferred to Delhi and then distributed in Delhi. But what we really see is that all of these networks mobilized together to actually form a water liberation campaign and the Center for Water Democracy. What is also interesting is that these networks had transnational linkages. Dr. Vandana Shiva, who is a very famous environmentalist and ecologist, was one of the prime mobilizers of this movement, and she brought people from Bolivia, from the United States, from Canada to stand up in support of the bank's privatization of water in Delhi. What is also interesting is that the government, which we think is a monolithic agency, was not a monolithic agency, and there were dissenting voices within the government, engineers and bureaucrats that formed a Water Workers Alliance and actually mobilized themselves as far as these groups were concerned. So just to show you some pictures, press again was an important actor in India for the wide coverage of the controversy and supporting that the reforms were for privatization. As you can see, these are some of the protest movements that were done in the water liberation campaign, which were against privatization. These are some of the pictures that were there, which said that whatever the bank is saying is really not going to improve good governance, is not going to create sustainable development or alleviate poverty. These were, again, protests against the World Bank president when he visited India. And so what the networks of resistance did, they created an alternative form of knowledge. So we had a knowledge that was coming from structures of dominance, and we also had a knowledge that was coming from a bottom-up approach, whereby these networks said the project is anti-poor, and they also created an own feasibility study which said that the sustainability of the utility is possible without private sector participation, but these reports and their voices were lost in the corridors of power. So how do we analyze global water governance as it operated in India or as it operates in most developing societies? We can see that an atmosphere was created and was established through narratives of irregularity, poor reliability, scarcity, inefficiency, necessitating water reform. A network of experts, technicians, administrators, strategists, political advocates were mobilized to drive this vision forward. Invited expertise came from, global expertise came from invited participants like consultants who essentially adopted the outlook of the bank, and workshops were held with invited stakeholders to promote the issue as uncontroversial and consensus. The goal was that economic growth driven by technical experts and states and nations engaged in a donor-client relationship will be able to promote sustainable development and alleviate poverty. So what are the conclusions that I draw from my case study in terms of how the processes of global water governance operate across the world? Global water governance is an engagement in deliberative exclusionary processes where we saw that there were structures of dominance and networks of power that dominated the discourse of these global entities, and of course, engagement with participatory processes through processes of invited stakeholders, workshops. How successful was that was determined by the multiplicity of force relationship between them. Global water governance exists as a rational technical solution to water crisis, and at the same time, it is a political instrument of control and a symbolic device. So we kind of see that simultaneously, global water governance behaves that way. In global water governance, transmission of knowledge networks play a very, very important role. And we can see that there were narratives of MNCs, actors, globalized connections, government of India, and all of these networks operated outside of the realm of democratic politics. And lastly, global water governance did consist of spaces of intervention that operated outside the dominant discourses in which water policy was contested. In the case of India, there were two differential outcomes of this process of global water governance. While the treatment plant, which was given to the multinational Suez Ondio, continued to be where it was, and it still is a privatized treatment plant, the distribution network was very strongly contested by these networks of resistance, which led the government of India to ask the bank to go back. The government of India and the government of Delhi returned the World Bank loan, although on the websites of both the Delhi government and on the World Bank, this project still occupies an important place. Thank you.